Mark Sanders lived by a simple mantra: push limits, achieve results. But nothing could prepare him for Alice Drake, a client whose vulnerability drew him in and whose love would push him beyond all limits. Their affair was a reckless gamble, hidden in the corners of the gym and under the cover of night. But secrets rarely stay buried, and Alice's husband has no intention of letting their betrayal go unanswered. When passion meets paranoia and love turns to violence, Mark and Alice are forced to confront the ultimate question: how far is too far when everything is on the line? Before we continue, friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second for you, but for me, it's an extra motivation to keep creating videos. I'd also really appreciate a comment. Thank you for your support, and now let's continue with the story. The faint hum of treadmills and the rhythmic clang of weights created a symphony unique to the gym. It was the pulse of Los Angeles ambition, a place where bodies were sculpted, insecurities buried under layers of sweat, and fleeting moments of connection found amidst the pursuit of perfection. The air smelled of citrus-scented cleaner and determination, mingling in a heady concoction that felt intoxicating to some and oppressive to others. For Mark Sanders, it was the smell of success. Mark moved through the gym like a conductor orchestrating a masterpiece, every interaction purposeful, every movement measured. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room, his easy smile a magnet for trust. Clients revered him not just for his expertise but for the way he made them feel seen. Fitness wasn't just his business. It was his identity. He could read bodies like books, and Alice Drake was no exception. Alice wasn't the kind of woman who blended into the background. She walked in that day dressed in sleek black leggings and a tank top that revealed arms more delicate than toned. Her hair was pulled into a high ponytail, exposing a face that looked composed but betrayed a hint of hesitation. Her eyes, a shade of green that seemed to shift under the fluorescent lights, lingered on the treadmills before landing on Mark. She hesitated, but not for long. Mark noticed her before she even approached. Something about the way she carried herself, a quiet elegance wrapped in a veil of sadness, caught his attention. She wasn't his usual client, the Hollywood hopefuls desperate for quick fixes or the high-powered executives chasing impossible standards. Alice was different. There was a vulnerability in her that he found unsettlingly compelling. "Hi, I'm Alice," she said, her voice soft but firm, as if rehearsed. "I'm looking for a personal trainer, someone who can help me feel stronger." Mark extended his hand, his smile warm and reassuring. "You've come to the right place, Alice. I'm Mark. Why don't we sit down and talk about your goals?" As they settled into the corner of the gym reserved for consultations, Alice began to open up. Her life, she explained, had grown stagnant. Married young to a man who now seemed more invested in his career than in their relationship, she felt adrift. The gym, she hoped, would be her anchor, a place to reclaim herself, both physically and emotionally. Mark listened intently, his usual detachment wavering under the weight of her honesty. Her words painted a picture he knew too well: the loneliness that creeps in when love turns cold, the restless search for something to fill the void. It wasn't his place to get personal, but her story lingered in his mind long after she left that day. Their first training session was uneventful, almost professional to a fault. Alice struggled through the routines, her body unfamiliar with the demands, but she pushed on with a quiet determination that impressed him. Over the next few weeks, the stiffness between them began to thaw. Their sessions were punctuated by laughter and shared anecdotes, moments that made the gym feel less like a space of physical exertion and more like a sanctuary. Mark found himself looking forward to their time together, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. Alice was like a puzzle, her elegance masking layers of complexity he couldn't resist unraveling. She, in turn, began to see him as more than just a trainer. He was attentive in a way her husband hadn't been in years, his encouragement filling the empty spaces her marriage had left behind. The connection was subtle at first, a hand lingering on hers as he adjusted her grip on a barbell, a smile that lingered too long after a joke. They danced around an unspoken line, neither willing to acknowledge it but both acutely aware of its presence. And then came the night that changed everything. The gym was nearly empty, the echoes of earlier activity replaced by a hushed stillness. Alice had stayed late, pushing herself through extra reps as if trying to outpace her own thoughts. Mark, finishing up with another client, noticed her and wandered over. "Burning the midnight oil?" he teased, leaning against the squat rack. Alice looked up, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Something like that. Just needed the distraction, I guess." Mark nodded, his gaze searching hers. "Everything okay?" Her hesitation was brief but telling. "It's just been hard, you know? Feeling like you're not enough for someone who's supposed to love you." The rawness of her confession caught him off guard. He hesitated, then sat down beside her on the bench. "Alice, you're more than enough. If someone doesn't see that, it's their loss, not yours." Her eyes welled up, but she blinked back the tears, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "You always know the right thing to say, don't you?" Mark shrugged, a hint of vulnerability breaking through his confident exterior. "Not always." The silence between them stretched, heavy with possibilities. Then, without thinking, Alice reached out, her fingers brushing against his. It was a simple gesture, but it ignited something in both of them. Mark froze, his heart pounding as he met her gaze. In that moment, the line they'd been dancing around vanished. Started with a kiss, tentative, hesitant, but electric. The kind of kiss that rewrites everything you thought you knew about yourself. When they finally pulled away, the reality of what they'd done hit them like a freight train. Neither spoke, but the weight of their shared guilt and exhilaration hung in the air. As Alice gathered her things and left, Mark sat alone in the dimly lit gym, his mind racing. He knew he should feel regret, but all he could think about was the way her touch had made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. What had they just set in motion? And more importantly, how long could they keep it hidden? The rhythm of Alice's life began to shift in subtle ways. She rose earlier, her movements quieter but sharper, as if each step carried a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. In the evenings, she lingered in the kitchen long after dinner, her hands moving absently as she cleaned dishes already spotless. Roderick noticed. He noticed everything. At first, he didn't say anything, watching instead as Alice's phone stayed glued to her side or as she meticulously styled her hair for her workouts. Details that struck him as unnecessary for a simple trip to the gym. Roderick's sharp eye for detail, honed from years of legal work, had been one of his greatest strengths in court. Now it turned inward, focused entirely on his wife. He didn't question her directly. Not yet. Suspicion was a game of patience, and Roderick was a man who knew how to wait. Alice, meanwhile, didn't realize how transparent she had become. Her shifts in mood, the energy that seemed to ripple through her when she returned from the gym, the occasional hesitation when answering Roderick's questions. All small cracks in the mask she thought she wore so well. But it wasn't just at home where her behavior betrayed her. Mark had begun to notice it too. During their sessions, Alice's focus sometimes wavered, her gaze flicking to the windows or the clock as if anticipating something, or someone. She had always been poised, but now there was an edge to her movements, a kind of nervous energy that mirrored his own. Their connection had deepened, but so had the risks. It wasn't long before others started picking up on it. Tony, a veteran trainer with a sharp tongue and a knack for reading people, had taken a particular interest in Mark's recent behavior. Tony had worked alongside Mark long enough to recognize when something or someone had gotten under his skin. At first, it was little things. Mark spending extra time on a single client, the way he seemed more focused when Alice was in the room. But it was the subtle, unconscious gestures that gave it away. The way Mark's eyes followed her when she wasn't looking, or the faint smile that appeared whenever her name came up. One evening, after most of the clients had left, Tony leaned against the counter near the trainer's office, watching as Mark finished logging his appointments for the week. "You've been spending a lot of time with Alice lately," Tony said, his tone light but loaded. "Must be some dedicated client." Mark didn't look up, keeping his voice steady. "She's working hard. Wants to make progress." "Yeah, I bet she does." Tony smirked, crossing his arms. "You know, people talk. Clients notice when a trainer starts playing favorites. Mark's jaw tightened, but he forced a casual shrug. I treat all my clients the same. Tony's smirk widened. Sure you do. Just remember, this isn't the kind of place where secrets stay secret for long. The words lingered like smoke in the air, their meaning clear. Mark didn't reply, but his grip on the edge of the counter tightened until his knuckles turned white. Tony walked away, but the seed of paranoia had already been planted. At home, Roderick was planting seeds of his own. While Alice showered one evening, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Roderick glanced at the screen, noting the name displayed, Mark S. The message preview read innocuously enough, "Great work tonight. Let's push for more reps next time." But the casual familiarity of it set his teeth on edge. He didn't open the message. Instead, he began a quiet campaign of observation. He checked the gym bag she left in the hallway, noting items that didn't belong. A lipstick she hadn't worn in years, a faint trace of cologne on her towel. He started arriving home earlier than usual, watching as she rushed to tidy up or feigned indifference when he asked how her workouts had gone. The confrontation, when it came, was as cold and calculated as Roderick himself. One Friday evening, Alice returned home to find Roderick sitting in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "You're back late," he said, his voice measured. Alice set her bag down, forcing a smile. "I stayed for a cool down. Lost track of time." Roderick nodded slowly, closing the laptop. "I'm sure. You've been losing track of time a lot lately." The accusation hung in the air like a loaded gun. Alice froze, her mind racing for a response, but Roderick didn't wait for one. He rose, walking toward her with the kind of controlled menace that made him a force to be reckoned with in court. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alice's breath caught, her eyes widening. "What are you talking about?" Roderick smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Don't insult me, Alice. I know you've been seeing someone. You think I don't notice the way you've been acting? The phone calls, the extra time at the gym, the way you can't even look me in the eye anymore." Her denial was immediate, but unconvincing. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've always been terrible at lying." Alice opened her mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she turned and walked toward the stairs, her heart pounding as Roderick's voice followed her. "This isn't over, Alice. Not by a long shot." Meanwhile, Mark's world was beginning to crack under the pressure. Tony's thinly veiled warnings had left him on edge, his interactions with Alice tinged with a growing sense of paranoia. Their stolen moments became more cautious, their conversations quieter, but the tension between them only grew. One evening, as they lingered in the dimly lit stretch of hallway near the gym's exit, Mark pulled Alice aside, his voice low and urgent. "I think Tony knows something." Alice's eyes darted toward the main floor, her expression anxious. "How?" "I don't know. He's been watching me, making comments. He's too smart to come out and say it, but he knows." Alice swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "What do we do?" Mark hesitated, his mind racing. "We need to be more careful. No more texting. No more extra sessions. If we're going to keep this under control, we have to be smarter." Alice nodded, but her hands trembled as she gripped the strap of her bag. She glanced at the glass doors leading to the parking lot, her reflection staring back at her like a ghost. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the equipment room, Tony's sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He didn't say anything that night, but his smirk as he locked up the gym spoke volumes. The quiet tension at home had become unbearable. Alice could feel it in the air, in the way the house seemed too silent despite Roderick's presence. He had always been meticulous. His world of law demanded precision, but now his focus felt invasive. Every question he asked her was casual on the surface but came with an undertone she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just his words, though. It was the way he watched her, like he was waiting for a crack in her facade. Alice tried to keep her routine steady, convincing herself that if she acted normal, he wouldn't have reason to dig deeper. But normal was no longer possible. She found herself checking her phone constantly, deleting messages from Mark the moment they came in. Her movements at home were sharper, more calculated, and she avoided lingering in Roderick's presence whenever possible. Then, one evening, something happened that Alice hadn't anticipated. She was sorting through laundry in their bedroom, her mind drifting, when Roderick's voice called from downstairs. "Alice, can you come here?" There was nothing unusual in his tone, but her stomach twisted anyway. She folded a pair of socks slowly, trying to steady herself before descending the stairs. Roderick was in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. He looked up at her with a small, tight smile. "What is it?" she asked, her voice as calm as she could make it. Roderick gestured to the laptop. "I got a notification today. My credit card flagged a purchase I didn't recognize." Alice's chest tightened, but she forced a puzzled look. "What kind of purchase?" He turned the screen toward her. It displayed an order confirmation from an online boutique. A necklace, sleek and understated, the kind of thing she might wear. "I didn't buy this," Roderick said, his gaze sharp. "Did you?" Alice's pulse raced. She had bought it, but not for herself. It had been an impulsive gift for Mark, something small to mark their growing connection. She had paid for it with Roderick's card by mistake, distracted in the checkout process. I must have," she stammered. "I was shopping online, and I didn't realize I used your card." "I'm sorry." Roderick didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "And when were you planning to tell me about it?" "I didn't think it was a big deal," she said quickly, her voice strained. "It's just a necklace." "Just a necklace," he repeated, his tone unreadable. "Well, I hope whoever it's for appreciates it." Her stomach dropped, but she forced a laugh. "It's for me, Roderick. Who else would it be for?" He didn't answer. Instead, he closed the laptop and stood, walking toward the kitchen. Alice stayed frozen for a moment, her mind racing, before retreating back upstairs. The crack in her facade had formed, and she could feel it widening. At the gym, things were unraveling in their own way. Tony wasn't just watching anymore, he was taking action. His smirks and snide comments had been replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. Mark noticed him lingering near the front desk more often, flipping through client files under the guise of organizing schedules. Once, Mark caught him near the security cameras, fiddling with the controls. "What are you doing?" Mark asked, keeping his tone casual. Tony looked up, his expression innocent. "Oh, just making sure these are working properly. Never know when you might need a little extra security around here." Mark nodded, forcing himself to walk away, but his gut told him Tony's motives weren't so simple. He was right. 2 nights later, after Alice had left the gym following a late session, Mark found something tucked behind the water fountain where they often lingered to talk. It was a small, black device, a voice recorder. His heart sank as he picked it up, his mind racing with the implications. Tony. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He stormed into the trainer's office, where Tony was leaning back in a chair, scrolling through his phone. "This yours?" Mark demanded, tossing the recorder onto the desk. Tony's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "Where'd you find that?" "You know exactly where I found it," Mark snapped. "What the hell are you doing?" Tony leaned forward, his expression shifting into something colder. "What I have to do." Mark clenched his fists, struggling to keep his temper in check. "You don't know what you're playing with." Tony smirked. "Oh, I think I do. And from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're the one who's out of his depth." Mark left before he could do something he'd regret, but the encounter left him shaken. He knew Tony wouldn't stop. The only question was how far he'd go. Alice felt the shift in Mark's demeanor immediately during their next session. He was quieter, his usual warmth replaced by a tension she couldn't ignore. "What's wrong?" she asked, adjusting the straps on a resistance band. "Tony," Mark said simply. "He's not just watching anymore." He planted a recorder near the water fountain. "I found it." Alice froze, her breath catching. "A recorder? He's recording us." Mark nodded. "I confronted him about it. He didn't deny it." "What does he want?" she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. I don't know, Mark admitted, but I don't think this is going to end until he gets something he can use. Alice looked around the gym, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every corner where someone might be lurking. What are we going to do? Mark didn't answer. He didn't have one. The breaking point came 2 nights later. Alice had stayed late, her nerves frayed after another tense day at home. Mark was locking up when Tony appeared, stepping out of the shadows with a casual ease that made Alice's skin crawl. Well, Tony said, his voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. The 2 lovebirds all alone. Mark stepped between Tony and Alice, his jaw tight. What do you want? Tony grinned, but there was no humor in it. I've got enough to make things very uncomfortable for both of you. Recordings, pictures. People love a good scandal, don't they? You've been following us? Alice asked, her voice trembling. Tony shrugged. Call it curiosity. And now, I'm curious about how much you're willing to pay to keep this little arrangement under wraps. Mark's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. We don't have anything to give you. Sure you do, Tony said, stepping closer. I'm not just talking about money. I want you out, Mark. This is my gym, and I'm not going to let you ruin it. You're blackmailing me, Mark said flatly. Tony smirked. Call it what you want. But if you don't play along, this little story is going public. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark glanced at Alice, her face pale, before turning back to Tony. You're making a mistake. No, Mark, Tony said, his voice cold. You did. Tony walked out, leaving them standing in the dimly lit gym, the weight of his threat pressing down on them like a storm waiting to break. Mark and Alice exchanged a glance, but neither spoke. The fragile illusion they had clung to was gone, and they were out of options. The first sign of trouble was so subtle that Alice almost missed it. Her car, parked as usual in their driveway, seemed untouched. But when she reached for the door handle one morning, her gaze lingered on the edge of the window. There, just visible against the glass, was a tiny adhesive smudge. It was so faint that anyone else might have overlooked it, but Alice knew her car inside and out. She froze, her hand hovering just above the handle. Had Roderick been in her car? Her mind raced as she slid into the driver's seat. Nothing appeared out of place. Her gym bag was still on the passenger side, and the air freshener swung lazily from the rearview mirror. But as she adjusted the mirror, her eyes caught a tiny black square tucked beneath the dashboard, its red light blinking faintly. A tracker. Her breath caught, and her fingers trembled as she ran them over the device. She felt the walls closing in, her carefully constructed world splintering under Roderick's growing suspicion. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she pried the tracker loose and shoved it into her gym bag before pulling out of the driveway. At the next red light, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach churn. Roderick. Heading to the gym again? You're very committed these days. She deleted the message, her grip tightening on the wheel. He wasn't just watching her anymore. He was following her, testing her, waiting for her to slip. Roderick's nights had grown restless, his mind a storm of suspicion and anger. He had always prided himself on control, on knowing every detail of his life. But now, watching Alice, he felt as if someone had stolen the script and rewritten it in a language he didn't understand. He replayed the memory of seeing her with Mark outside the gym. The casual way they had stood together, their heads tilted close in conversation, had seemed innocent enough to an outsider. But Roderick knew Alice better than she thought. He had seen the faint smile she tried to suppress, the way she adjusted her hair as she spoke. She hadn't done that for him in years. His investigation became methodical. He began leaving work earlier, citing headaches or fatigue, only to park his car a block away from the gym and watch. He followed her routes, noting how often she lingered in the parking lot or left later than her usual session time. Each observation added to the puzzle, and with every new piece, his rage simmered closer to the surface. One night, unable to contain himself, he searched her phone while she showered. Scrolling through her messages, he found nothing incriminating. Alice had been careful. But it was in the recently deleted folder that he discovered a message from someone named M. It was short but damning. "Great work today. Let's push harder tomorrow." His hand tightened around the phone, his vision narrowing. He slipped it back onto the counter just as Alice emerged, her hair wrapped in a towel. She smiled at him, but he didn't smile back. The game was over. Now it was a matter of confrontation. Tony crouched behind the gym's storage lockers, his movements practiced and precise. He had spent years observing people, learning their habits and weaknesses. Mark and Alice were no different. Their lingering glances and stolen moments had made them easy to track. But Tony wasn't just after confirmation. He wanted leverage. Planting the camera had been simple. He knew the gym's blind spots, the angles that security wouldn't cover. The recorder he'd placed earlier had already provided him with enough suggestive conversations to threaten Mark. But Tony wanted more. He wanted undeniable proof. As he adjusted the camera's angle, he smiled to himself. He didn't hate Mark, not really. But the man had always carried himself with an air of superiority that grated on Tony's nerves. And Alice? She was collateral damage, a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. For Tony, this was about power, about proving that even the golden boy could fall. Later, when Mark discovered the device and confronted him, Tony didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his grin widening as Mark's anger bubbled over. "You're out of your depth, Mark," Tony said, his voice calm. "You can't outsmart me. Just accept it." Mark left, his fists clenched at his sides. But Tony knew he wouldn't stay quiet for long. That was fine. Tony had the upper hand and he intended to use it. The parking lot was nearly empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the asphalt. Alice leaned against her car, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She had texted Mark to meet her, unable to wait another moment to tell him about the tracker. When he arrived, his expression was grim. "He's tracking me," Alice said, her voice barely above a whisper. She opened her bag and showed him the device. "I found this in my car." Mark swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "Tony's not letting up either. He's planted cameras. I found one near the lockers." Alice's breath quickened. "What do we do? How do we stop this?" Before Mark could answer, the sound of a car door slamming cut through the silence. They turned to see Tony approaching, his hands in his pockets and a smug smile on his face. "Well, isn't this a touching scene?" he said, his tone mocking. The star trainer and his favorite client. Mark stepped forward, his posture tense. "What do you want, Tony?" Tony stopped a few feet away, tilting his head as if considering the question. "I think you already know. You're gonna walk away, Mark. Leave the gym, leave Alice, and this all goes away." Alice's voice trembled as she spoke. "And if he doesn't?" Tony's eyes gleamed. "Then I take everything I have to her husband. Trust me, sweetheart. He won't be as forgiving as I am." Mark's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're bluffing." Tony laughed, the sound cold and sharp. "Am I? You really want to test me?" The tension crackled like a live wire. Alice's hands shook as she reached for Mark, her voice breaking. "We can't let him do this." Mark looked at her, his jaw tight. "We won't." Tony stepped closer, his smile fading. "You've got 24 hours to make your decision. After that, it's out of my hands." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty lot. Alice and Mark stood in silence, the weight of his threat pressing down on them. The walls were closing in, and they were running out of time. Alice's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she navigated the winding suburban streets. The sun had barely risen, but she was already suffocating in the walls of her home. Roderick's presence, once a distant hum in her life, now felt like a constant shadow. His words from the night before still echoed in her mind. Calm, measured, and yet sharp enough to leave wounds. She replayed their conversation as if searching for a crack in his demeanor, a clue to how much he truly knew. But Roderick had always been an enigma. Even as a young lawyer, he had mastered the art of saying little while thinking much. And now, his silence spoke louder than any accusation. At a red light, she glanced down at her hands. They trembled against the leather, her wedding ring glinting in the morning sun, felt heavier than ever. When the light turned green, she pressed the gas pedal harder than she meant to, the engine growling as the car surged forward. At the gym, Mark was pacing near the front desk, his face pale and drawn. He glanced up when Alice walked in, his posture stiffening. Without a word, he motioned her toward the lockers, where the two of them could talk without being overheard. Alice followed, her heart pounding with every step. "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice low but urgent. She swallowed, glancing over her shoulder before answering. "He knows something. He's been searching." Mark's brow furrowed. "Searching how?" Alice hesitated, then opened her bag. She pulled out the tracker she had found in her car, its blinking light now silent after she had disabled it. Mark took it from her, turning it over in his hands. "He's tracking you," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "Damn it, Alice. I didn't know until yesterday," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I took it out as soon as I found it." Mark tossed the tracker into the trash, his movements sharp. "It doesn't matter now. If he's gone this far, he's not going to stop." Alice leaned against the lockers, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What are we supposed to do? We can't keep running like this." Mark hesitated, glancing around the gym as if the walls themselves might betray them. "We need to deal with Tony first. He's the immediate threat." That afternoon, Roderick sat in his car, parked in a quiet spot a block away from the gym. His laptop rested on the passenger seat, a folder of documents open beside it. He had always been methodical in his work, and this situation was no different. Doubt had no place in his mind anymore. What he needed now was confirmation. His discovery in Alice's car had been the tipping point. At first, he had told himself it was a coincidence, that the receipt could have been for a friend or a gift for him. But the date and the nature of the purchase didn't add up. Alice wasn't careless, and yet she had left behind this single thread for him to pull. And pull he did. He found himself scrolling through old credit card statements, searching for more anomalies. Small charges, coffee shops near the gym, late-night takeout orders, began to paint a picture. Nothing conclusive, but enough to fuel his resolve. He didn't feel anger, not yet. What he felt was clarity, the kind that came with knowing the truth was within reach. As he watched the gym's entrance, his phone buzzed with a message. "Unknown number. Tonight, you'll have answers. Parking lot. After close." Roderick stared at the message, his mind racing. The sender didn't identify themselves, but the intent was clear. Someone knew about Alice, and they wanted him to know too. That evening, as the last few clients trickled out of the gym, Tony moved with practiced ease through the quiet space. His gaze flicked to the corners where he had planted his devices, ensuring they remained undisturbed. He had spent years honing this skill, watching, waiting, collecting just enough to tilt the balance of power in his favor. He paused near the front desk, pulling out his phone to check the time. The message he had sent to Roderick had been a calculated risk, but it was worth it. Tony had no interest in leaving loose ends, and bringing the husband into the fold was the final move he needed to secure his advantage. When he stepped into the parking lot, the air was thick with the anticipation of an impending storm. Mark was already waiting, his posture rigid, fists clenched at his sides. Tony smirked as he approached, his every step deliberate. "You're early," Tony said, his tone casual. "Nervous?" Mark didn't respond immediately. He stared at Tony with a quiet intensity that made the latter pause for a moment. "What do you want, Tony?" Mark finally asked, his voice low. Tony shrugged. "Same thing I've always wanted. Control. And right now I've got it." Mark took a step closer, his hands still at his sides but his stance threatening. "You think you've won, but you don't know how far I'm willing to go to stop you." Tony's smirk faltered for the first time. He opened his mouth to retort when a car's headlights swept across the lot, blinding them both. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and Roderick stepped out, his expression carved from stone. "Well," Tony muttered, "looks like we've got company." Roderick didn't speak at first. He took in the scene before him. Mark standing tense and defensive, Tony with his usual air of smugness. His gaze lingered on Mark, his eyes narrowing. "You," Roderick said, his voice sharp. "You're the trainer." Mark straightened, meeting Roderick's glare. "Roderick, this isn't—" "Don't," Roderick cut him off, his tone icy. "I don't want excuses. I want the truth." Tony folded his arms, watching the exchange with thinly veiled amusement. "Seems like you've got a lot to talk about. Should I leave you two alone?" Roderick shot him a glare that silenced any further commentary. He turned his attention back to Mark. "I want to know exactly what's been going on, and I want to hear it from you." Mark hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's complicated." "Complicated." Roderick took a step closer, his voice rising. "You've been sneaking around with my wife. What part of that is complicated?" Before Mark could respond, Alice's voice cut through the tension. "Stop." She stepped into the light, her face pale but determined. "This isn't Mark's fault. It's mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Roderick's gaze shifted to Alice, a mix of anger and betrayal flickering in his eyes. "You," he said, his voice trembling. "You did this?" Alice nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I made a mistake, but it wasn't Mark's doing." Roderick stared at her for a long moment, his fists clenching at his sides. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. The tires screeched as he sped away, leaving the three of them standing in the lot, the air thick with unspoken words. Tony broke the silence, his smirk returning. "Well, that was dramatic." Mark turned on him, his voice cold. "This isn't over." Tony laughed, the sound echoing in the empty lot. "No, it's not. But it's getting close." As he walked away, Alice and Mark stood in the shadows, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. They knew the storm was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. The air was heavy with tension, the quiet of the night amplifying the unspoken dread that hung between Alice and Mark. They stood in the gym's dimly lit parking lot, the echoes of Tony's laughter still lingering in the air like a taunt. Alice wrapped her arms around herself, the chill seeping into her skin as Mark stared at the darkened horizon where Roderick's car had disappeared. "This is falling apart," Alice whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much longer I can—" "Hey!" Mark's voice was firm but gentle as he stepped closer, his hands gripping her shoulders. "We're not done yet. We'll figure this out." Alice shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Roderick knows, Mark. He knows everything. And Tony, he's not going to stop until he ruins us." Mark didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened as he glanced back toward the gym, his mind racing. "Then we stopped them first." Roderick sat alone in his office, the harsh glow of the desk lamp highlighting the mess of papers scattered before him. The receipt from the necklace lay in the center, a damning artifact of Alice's betrayal. His fingers hovered over it, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Anger, hurt, and something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. He had spent the drive home replaying the parking lot confrontation, the moment Alice had stepped forward to claim responsibility. It had been like a knife to the chest, sharper and more devastating than he had expected. He thought he'd prepared himself for this revelation, but the truth had left him raw. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He straightened, slipping the receipt into a drawer. "Come in." The door creaked open, and one of his colleagues stepped inside, a stack of case files in hand. Roderick waved them off with a terse, "Leave them on the desk," but his colleague hesitated. "You all right, Drake? You've been off lately." Roderick forced a tight smile. "Just a lot on my plate." The colleague nodded, retreating without further comment. As the door clicked shut, Roderick leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the drawer where the receipt lay hidden. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The next evening, Tony walked into the gym with the same air of smug confidence that had become his trademark. But tonight, something felt different. The gym was quieter than usual, the staff subdued. He dismissed it as the fallout from the previous night's drama, but a flicker of unease wormed its way into his mind. As he approached the trainer's office, he noticed the door slightly ajar. Inside, Mark was sitting at the desk, His hands steepled as he stared at a piece of paper in front of him. Tony knocked lightly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Didn't think I'd see you here," Tony said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Figured you'd have packed up by now." Mark looked up, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to give you something first." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What's that?" Mark slid the paper across the desk. Tony picked it up, his smirk fading as he read the words. It was a formal complaint, outlining Tony's use of hidden recording devices and unauthorized surveillance of clients and staff. Attached were photographs of the devices Mark had found, timestamps from the gym's security cameras, and a statement from another trainer who had seen Tony planting one of the devices. Tony's hands clenched around the paper. "You think this will scare me?" Mark stood, his presence looming. "No, I think it'll ruin you." Tony opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "He's not bluffing." Alice stepped into the office, her gaze icy. She held up her phone, the screen showing a recording of Tony's conversation from the night before. The threats, the blackmail, all of it captured in damning clarity. Tony's smirk finally disappeared. "You set me up," he said, his voice low with disbelief. Mark's expression was cold. "You gave us no choice." At the same time, Roderick was piecing together the last elements of his plan. He had spent the day combing through his resources, using his connections to gather information on Tony. The man's background wasn't spotless. Suspicious terminations from previous gyms, allegations of misconduct that had mysteriously disappeared. It wasn't hard to see the pattern. When Roderick finally made his way to the gym that evening, he wasn't alone. Two plainclothes detectives followed him inside, their presence subtle but unmistakable. Roderick scanned the room, his sharp gaze landing on Tony, who was cornered in the trainer's office with Alice and Mark. "What's going on here?" Roderick's voice carried across the room, silencing the tension. Tony's head snapped up, his face pale. "Nothing you need to worry about." Roderick stepped closer, his posture commanding. "Oh, I think I do." The detectives stepped forward, one of them pulling out a badge. "Tony Marks, we have some questions about your activities here." Tony's eyes darted between the detectives, Mark, and Roderick. "This is ridiculous. You can't." "We can," the detective interrupted. "And we will. Let's go." As they escorted Tony out, the room fell into a heavy silence. Alice looked at Roderick, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why did you help?" Roderick's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Because this wasn't just about you. He was a danger to everyone here." Mark stepped forward, his voice steady. "Thank you." Roderick's eyes flicked to him, the edge returning. "Don't thank me. This doesn't change anything." Alice reached for Roderick's arm, but he pulled away, his voice firm. "We'll talk at home." He left without another word, leaving Alice and Mark standing in the aftermath of the storm. The days that followed were quieter, but the damage lingered. Tony's arrest sent ripples through the gym, and his departure was met with a mixture of relief and unease. Alice returned home to a husband who spoke little but watched everything. Their conversations were strained, their once comfortable silences now loaded with unspoken truths. Mark, meanwhile, threw himself into his work, determined to rebuild his reputation. He avoided Alice, their connection now a memory they couldn't afford to revisit. But every so often, he caught himself looking toward the parking lot, half expecting to see her there. The final encounter between the three of them came weeks later, in the quiet corner of a coffee shop. Roderick had called the meeting, his tone clipped but civil. He laid out the terms clearly. Alice would stay, but their marriage would change. Mark would remain distant, and their paths would not cross again. It was an uneasy truce, but it was the best they could hope for. As they parted ways, the weight of their choices hung heavy in the air. The scars of their decisions would linger, but the story had reached its end. Messy, fractured, but finished. Or so they thought.